and we go through it.
Hello, everyone. We'll give it another couple of minutes before we start. Hello, everyone. I'll get started. I hope you can see my screen. So this is part of the Workato product hour, which we do every 2 weeks. And in the past, we have covered list processing. We have covered other topics of interest, like what did we have? Files and attachments last time, and then this time we are going to cover the advanced trigger conditions and how to do advanced triggers. And in the upcoming weeks, we have data transformations, which is a big topic in itself, and then runtime operations, admin, etc. That's coming up in June 16th. So you can, if you go to this link, product.workato.com, you can see most of the old, actually not most of them, you'll see all of the old recordings there, and you can see the PowerPoints that we shared at that point. So like in most of the previous sessions, we'll do an overview, and then we'll go through use cases using demos, and then we'll open it up for question and answer. And if you have any questions during this session, you can use the chat to post your question, and we'll answer them during the session. Because sometimes, if it is in context, it's better to answer it there. So again, past webinars are all available at product.workato.com. You can also go to our YouTube channel, and there are videos. This video and other videos will be there. There are a whole bunch of videos there which talk about getting started and advanced topics. This is also a very good resource, the documentation, docs.workato.com. And in docs.workato.com, actually, you will find most of the topics that we're going to cover today, you'll find under triggers. I'll show you where. And this should say support.workato.com, and that's the Success Center, where you'll find other set of information. So in today's session, we'll talk about, just so we set the ground, we set the basics straight. So we'll just talk about what's the trigger and what does it do, etc. And then we'll talk about types of triggers and trigger filter conditions, and then how we can pull in information from the past, and then question and answers and troubleshooting. So what is a trigger? A trigger is something that is used to pull to pull information from applications and nudge a recipe to do something about it. So there are many ways in which you can kind of nudge the recipe. The recipe, again, is the thing that is doing the processing of the event that comes out. So you want to nudge the recipe, and so the simplest one, which is there, is when you're looking at Zendesk, you can say, I want to look at a new organization. I want to watch for new organization. Whenever that comes, wake me up, or new ticket, new user, etc. Same thing with other applications. So Jira, you can look at new issues, new project, and so on. So it's a specific trigger event, which is there as part of the trigger. It's a new organization, for example, or a new issue. Now, for some of them, the information is not specific but generic. So, for example, Salesforce and NetSuite and Servicenow. In those cases, we have a generic trigger which talks about which is a new object or a new event and so on. The advantage of this style, most of the advanced applications, we have this style of processing. The advantage is that if there's a new object added, we don't have to do anything to the trigger. It automatically becomes available. Same thing with if there's any customization to it, we don't have to worry about it. And then, so it's everything that is there in the app is covered, whether it's the object or whether the fields are different, everything is covered in this scheme of things. So most of the triggers which have matured over time and are very heavily used, you'll find this scheme, where it'll be a new object and you define the object that you're looking at. So you will have to do, say, new object, and then you'll select account as the object. So, for example, let me just take you here. And here you can see that it's the application is Salesforce and the trigger is new updated object and so on. But in the other case, which is something like Zendesk, here, or this is Google Contacts, you can see that it is Google Contacts and new contact added. It's not a generic trigger. Right. So that's that's useful to know, because sometimes when you're looking for if you're used to doing Zendesk or Google Contacts and so on, you go to Salesforce, you cannot find your object. So the other thing, sometimes when you're doing this, again, when you're creating it, sometimes by default it'll give you a especially for these kind of things, it'll give you a name next to it in brackets, especially in the triggers or in the case of actions. Don't worry about the name. It's the default that it has picked the default object it has picked based on what people have done in the past. So it's trying to look at the historical data and say, this is common, but don't get confused by it. You can just come down and select the actual object that you need. Okay, so then there's so that's so what is it that you're getting, right? So you're saying from Salesforce I want to get something, or from Jira I'm going to get something, but then how does the recipe get nudged, or how does a recipe get fed with data? So there are different ways in which you can get the recipe to get data. The simplest one is the polled approach. So if you don't say anything, or if you just say normal Salesforce trigger, for example, this one here, it's a simple one, and it doesn't, every 5 minutes it is just going to pull new data that is available, right? Then there is the real-time ones. So in real time, you'll see when you go to Salesforce, you'll see when you look at the trigger, it'll say real-time next to it. And so whenever it says real-time, that means if an event happens in the application, it is going to notify you about it, right? So it's the visual indicator is this real-time block that shows up. Now, what is important to know is that in some systems, you have to go and set up the system, set up the application to emit this webhook event, right? So, for example, if you're in Salesforce, you have to go to Salesforce and configure it to push out this real-time event. In some other cases, like Jira, we automatically set up the event for you. So whenever it is possible to do this, we will do it for you. But sometimes it is not, and you have to go and set it up. And if you go to our docs, you will under the specific application, you'll find out how to do it. So that's polled and real time. those are the most common ones. And then there is batch and scheduled. So if you look at batch, what happens is, what happens is it is similar to the, what was that? Okay. So it's similar to the regular trigger, like the poll trigger, except that it is going to give you information in batches. So if you look at this one here, it's instead of a new object created, it's a new object batch created, right? And it looks exactly the same, except that you specify a batch size. If you don't specify, it'll use the default batch size. Now, what happens in this case is that so what is happening in the background? So whenever we poll, we will get all the relevant objects or events that qualify. So let's say I'm looking for new accounts. The moment I query the first time, and let's say that there are 150 of these guys which are queued up, I will actually pull all of those 150 into Workato and queue them up inside. If I'm in the non-batched case, it is going to give it to me one by one, right? But if I'm in a batch case, if I use this kind of a trigger, then what it is going to do is it's going to give me the first 100, and then it is going to give me the next 50. So the advantage of this is that in terms of transactions, you'll see the number of jobs that show up. You'll see only one job for the 100 and another job for 50. So you'll have two jobs, as opposed to two transactions, as opposed to the singular case where you will get 150 of these transactions show up in your job history. So that's the advantage. The disadvantage is that when you do in batches, you don't see the details of every line that was processed. You'll see the first line that was processed. So again, I think you have to choose what is more important. Is the visibility is more important, or number of transactions, or efficiency of the recipe is more important? Because if you have tried it out and you're comfortable with what's going on, you may be okay with doing it in the batch mode. And also depends on your business activity. If the nature of things is such that you process in batches, it's probably better to do batches. If it is coming, throughout the day at some point in time, and you will need to move the data in real time to this other application, then it's better to not wait for the batch and continuously do this. Then there are other types of use cases. So I think we looked at this one, the poll use case, and then the real time. I think we saw it too, but let me just take you there. So this one is a real-time use case, and again, it has got everything similar to the other one, where you select an application, you select the trigger, and then you specify how long back you want to go, and select the object and so on, right? One thing I wanted to mention about webhooks or the real-time triggers is that sometimes the systems may not be very accurate, or it may not always give you a ping every time there is a webhook opportunity, or a webhook thing gets, a webhook event gets triggered. So what we do, just to make sure that everything is picked up, when we get that ping, we use that to go and sweep up everything from the system to pick up everything that was available from the last point we did a query. So so this is more like a smart webhook. So it avoids things being dropped, and you're sure that all the events that were processed or created from the last time I processed things is available to me. So that's important to know, because normal webhooks may be lossy if you use from other systems. It may be lossy, but because of this smart webhook technology, you'll not lose anything using this trigger. And then there's the scheduled search, which is, again, I think, let me just take you there. And here, and this is available for some things, especially for Salesforce, people do a lot of processing using this. So this one is similar, but, except that instead of using a simple trigger, I'm using a scheduled object search using SOQL. And the object is the donation object. And then here I give the conditions. So I'm saying, if the stage name equals receive as pledged, and something, and all of those things are available, right? So what this does is, this, I'm going to cover this a little bit later. You are looking, and then you're providing the schedule. Say I'm saying here that I'll do it daily and at 12 hours and 43 minutes, and it's specific zone and so on. And you can also specify which days of the week you want to do. So this gives you very fine-tuned access on when you want to pull the data. And the other thing which is interesting, which I'm going to talk about, is that what this SQL clause is doing is that it is going to filter out information even before it hits our system. So it is much more efficient to do it this way. There are some systems which we do not have a scheduled search for some, so scheduled search we have for Salesforce, we have for databases, but there are some systems which you don't have for scheduled triggers for. So for those guys, what you can do is you can use a scheduler event. Use the application as you choose the application, the scheduler as the application, and then you choose a new scheduled event as the trigger. And so what this lets you do is, so similar to your other one, it is going to be triggered every half an hour, or there is an advanced. So this is a simple one, and there's a new scheduled event advanced, which lets you control which day of the week, what time of the day, etc. And so what this does is it'll wake you up at that given time, and then below that you can do whatever you want to do. So you can search for tickets in Zendesk, or you can look for opportunities in Salesforce. And so in this particular case, what they were doing is, Zendesk does not have the scheduled search, so they're looking for information periodically every half an hour, and then they're looking to see if the number of new tickets created were more than a certain threshold number. So you can use this in many creative ways using this scheduled search. All right, so and then there's this fetch in batches and process or bulk, and this is I don't know if it's going to go there. This is, we looked at it a little bit, but this is slightly different. We talked about it before, and it's the same thing. Salesforce new object batch created, and then the batch size, so same as the other one.
So Aman, there is a question. Can you elaborate on the bulk object created trigger in Salesforce and how it should be used?
Yeah, so this is the bulk object created. So it's similar to the polled object, the polled trigger. So let's say that, the example I was talking about was the 150 events out there, less than 150 new accounts out there. If I did it using the normal trigger, I'll get 150 jobs for that, for processing that set. Now, if I use the bulk one, I will get one job, which will be for 100, another job, which will be for 50. So you'll see the two jobs, and then if you look at it down below, I think there's an example here. Yeah, so basically it's going to, let me just look for triggers. So I think there's a bulk example here. So here you can see there is an example given, and you see, this one I think is talking about 843 records that were eligible. So it processed it in batches of 100, and then a batch of 43. So that's how you'll see them. And then if you go into the details, I don't know if you can see it. So you'll see it like this, where it'll show, it'll not show all of the data, but it'll show only the top one. Right? And the other thing which is important to keep in mind is that normally when you're using this batch trigger or the bulk trigger, it is also good to couple it with batch actions. So for example, you fetched 100, then you want to save those 100 in one action. So batch create action or batch update action. So, it's very efficient processing because you're using Salesforce's bulk APIs to do the processing. Oops. Then there are two other types of things that, which we don't talk about in terms of, regular application triggers, but there are triggers which can be used as callable recipes. So when you are using a callable recipe, the recipe itself, the trigger itself is a call from another recipe. So it's also a trigger. It's, I'm waking up that called recipe, but it is coming from another recipe, right? So it's a slight variation of the same concept, but it's good to know that. And if you have questions on that, we can go on that. We can discuss more on that. The other one is that callable recipes can also be set up to be invoked from outside. So if you have HTTP access from Salesforce or Servicenow or Jira, you can make a call from that application, and it'll make this call to the callable recipe, and it'll come through the API gateway. So it's also a trigger, but it's getting triggered from not from an application, but from other events. Okay, so now there's some other concepts in the triggers. Let's just go about. Let's talk about those. So one is that there's this from parameter here, and in the from parameter there are various ways of selecting what is the from. So one is you select it from the drop down. So you can select a time. So is it from recipe start, an hour ago, yesterday, etc. Or you can click on this button here, and it'll let you select a custom date. So let's just go and.
Yeah.
Which one?
You can click on that.
And I think most of you probably know about this one. So if I go in here, you can see from last month. And if I wanted to change this, I can just go into a regular recipe and change that.
So just to clarify, when it says last month and hour ago from when? What is the
hour ago from the start of the recipe, the first time it started. Okay, so that's a good point. For people who are using Workato for a long time, they know about it. But although it says an hour ago, over here it says hour ago or last month, you don't know when that last month was. We are talking about putting a timestamp here, which will say when was the first time it was started. But yeah, this thing is the from, after you have run the recipe, this gets frozen. You cannot change it anymore because it doesn't make sense. Because what it is doing is it's going back in the past, it's picking it up, and then it has processed all those records. Once it's processed, it doesn't make sense to go and reprocess those records again. Right. So this from parameter, you can choose from the list, or you can set a custom date by selecting a specific date and time, and and then the cursor cannot be reset after the recipe has been run once. Okay, so then there is controlling the trigger filter, right? So what does the recipe do? Like I said, what does the trigger do? The first time you're running it, it's pulling in all the data that was available to it, and and that matches the criteria. So if it was the last time it was run was, let's say, an hour ago, and if it's running now, it's going to pick up all the new records that have been processed or that have been created during that time, right? So there are several ways of, but you may not want all of these records. Let's say, for example, if you are getting only opportunities that are in the closed won state, right? So you don't want to take every update and process it. So one way of doing that is to do a filter, a fetch and then filter, which is the normal way most people do it. And what that does is, actually this is using a SQL query, so it's the other one. So what you do, in a normal recipe, let's look at this one. So what this is going to do is it's going to pull all the new cards in Trello, and then it is going to filter out things, or it is going to filter things and push things down below only if it matches this criteria, right? So in terms of work being done by Workato, it is actually pulling all the records and then filtering out things, right? So that's this case, fetch and then filter. But the other one that we are showing, this one here, is actually going to do the filtering before, because I'm using Salesforce to make this query. So it's going to give me a filtered list already. So this is going to be much more efficient in terms of processing. And that's the use case here, the filter then fetch. And in the most common one, you don't use any filter at all, right? Okay, so then any questions?
Just one for now.
Okay. So let's go into some of these cases. Any specific area that we want to talk about, which is the use cases that we were talking about?
The most common scenario, like when you set up a trigger, how do you know it's working? Like, how do you test a trigger that it's actually fetching data, and how do you test the output for a trigger?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's go into one of those guys. So let's create a recipe. So one of the things that people face is, like there are two types of questions which come up. One is why is my trigger not working, and the second one is what should I use? Should I use a polling trigger or a webhook trigger? Should I use a new object or an updated object? Should I use batch or not batch? Let's just cover those questions one by one, right? So let's go and create a recipe. So you just select an application, and then you select an event. It's a new object, and here, so here we are saying an hour ago. Here you can do enter custom value. You can select any date in the past, and I can go and say 2001. I can select an object. So now, the other thing here, I think many times you'll find that, there are these fields which are hidden, add optional fields here. So here is where you can open this up. There are two things here. One is SQL query. I can give it a SQL query to do the filtering before it hits Workato. And the other thing is this field list. And this is, again, available for certain applications and not, so Salesforce has it, QuickBase has it, I think Jira has it. So what this does is, if the object is really huge, then you don't want to get all of that information back into Workato. So you just want to get only maybe 5 or 10 of those fields in. So to open that up, you have to click on this thing here. So sometimes you don't see it and you miss it, right? Especially for QuickBase users, I think this is very important because QuickBase has many of the QuickBase tables have 2,000, 3,000 fields, and if you are getting all of them in, it takes a long time to load. So the first thing I do, and then we talked about the trigger filter here, right? So you can see what to filter by, and you can see on the side, any of these things are eligible. So I don't do anything. I just create this filter, and then maybe I don't want to do anything here. I just remove the action, and let me just choose a different. And when I do this, I did a start here, but I could have done a test. So what this will do is it is just going to go and fetch this. So this is another thing I do when I'm testing, is that I'll not write any actions before I see if the recipe triggers are bringing anything.
So there's a question like, does the field list then narrow down the fields that are being retrieved by Workato?
Mm-hmm. Yes, the question was, when you put the field list here, let's just go back to the recipe. So if I add a field list here, it is going to show only, so here, like if you are looking at the trigger if condition, you will see that all of these fields are here, right? But if I use only the account ID and account fax and account name, then you will see only those fields. So let's try and do that. So let's say account ID, account name, account number. Now what you have to do is, you have to actually give the names. So what I do is I put it here and see what it is called. So account number, and okay. That's name. Make sure it's got the right object ID. Maybe. So if I do that, put the field list here, and if I come here, so right now it's showing all of them, but once I save it and filter it, refresh the schema, I should show only the few. Sometimes it doesn't show up right away. Did I do something less of case? Do I have to do the comma? Sometimes it takes comma, sometimes it doesn't. So there you see account ID. Did I give the name wrong? So it's got the account ID. So it should show only those, right? I must have made a mistake in how I put these things out. In account ID. Account ID, account name.
I think we can fix this and share the recipe. Yeah.
Yeah, it should show up only the three things there. If Demetrius is there,
yes.
The answer is yes. Okay. If Demetrius is there, actually, let me. Hey, Demetrius, is anyone? Is he on the call?
I think it's just you and me. So
okay, yeah. So it should show up with the name, and so yes, it is supposed to do that. So you will see only the list of items that I'm selected. So I think I'm not sure if I'm putting the right name here. This thing is actually important. It has to be exactly how the name is supposed to be. All right. So then that was one. So let's see. So then, the other issue, so this one doesn't have any events, what I'm looking at. The other thing that you can do when you're testing is, sometimes, when you're doing the test recipe, and if you see that nothing is coming back, one of the things to do is to see if the connection is still good, right? So here, if the connection is not good, it will not pick up anything. So sometimes what I do is I'll disconnect it and then connect it again. And that will, that will make sure that it is good. Another problem is sometimes the oops, I think it's not giving some. Today the demos cards are not doing. I think it's not set up right. Okay, so that I reconnected. The other thing is that sometimes it may be that the setting I'm using. So this is a very good use case. The setting I'm using is probably not right. Maybe this account is not. There are no accounts from this date onwards, right? So sometimes what I'll do is I'll just make a copy of this, because after I've run it, you can see here. If I go back to the previous one. When I go back to the previous, and you'll see that the recipe trigger, this date cannot be changed anymore. See that the date has been it has been hidden from being updated. So the only way to do that is to kind of copy the recipe and change the date. So that's what you can do. And and maybe the account, there is nothing there. So maybe I'll go back to not this one, but I'll just go back from enters, select from list, and I'll just do beginning of time, and then it'll pull out information from there. Right. So I do a start, and it should do it. So that's another reason of. I think I put in here. That's another reason why you may not be getting information, because your start date was not right. The other one why you may not be getting anything is because you have set a trigger condition, and the trigger condition is kind of preventing information from coming in. And so in those cases, what I do is I'll take out the trigger condition and run the recipe or run the trigger and see if information is coming in, and then I can look at information and then see. So common use cases are, so let's say that if you are looking for something being true, or you're looking for the condition equals, right? So you can say closed one. The case of closed one may not be correct. So if you run it without the trigger filter, look at how the data comes out, and then use that information in the trigger filter, then that is a good way of kind of figuring out. Then there's another thing, which is let me just show you. So sometimes when you're doing this, when you're doing the trigger filter, it may be that you want to do some conditional actions, right? If you want to do, let's just stop this one. So this one you're seeing is pulling out information. So sometimes when you're doing a trigger filter, you can say I want to do account ID is present, and then I want to do an AND condition, which is account name is present. Oops. and then I want to do an or. I cannot do an or. So one of the problems with this, or one of the way it works, is that you can only do and of all the conditions or of all the conditions. You cannot mix and match. So to get around that, what people do is something like this. You can do a formula instead of condition. So here, if you go to this one, you will see that it is doing a start time is present and user ID is present. And if you wanted to do something else, you can say user ID is present or recipe ID is present. So I did one of them, which is the start time is present, and then I'm saying user ID is present or this one is present. So now using this, I can use, I can achieve the same result. So although the basic one doesn't allow you to do this, you can use it using formulas. Another thing which sometimes I get tripped up by is suppose I have an error in the formula. So suppose I put in trigger conditions here, and I may be having, formula errors here. So I can do some, I can make some errors here. So I can put something here which doesn't make sense, right? And if I do a test of it, sometimes it will not catch it. I don't know if this will catch it or not. So let's just see, save. Also, it is giving an error. But it's not throwing an error on top. So say, okay, so it's saying. So sometimes it doesn't give an error here, right? And when you're doing the test, it gives you an, maybe it is right, but it is, not completely right. So in those situations, you can actually do a start, and start will definitely catch any of these errors which are there. And if you actually find things like this happening, you should tell us, and we should fix it, because it should not be a case where you think that it is right and it is, it's not triggering. So in those cases, let us know if there's a problem. Okay, so now going back to the other cases, I think when we talk to people, there's always questions of, when should I use a polling trigger versus a webhooks trigger, right? So that question comes up often. We have, I think, covered it here. So when you're using a polling trigger, you're looking at information for every 5 minutes or so. We are polling and asking if there's an information. Now, when do you use polling and when do you use webhooks? Since you're using webhooks and real time, occasionally, most of the people don't use it all the time. What's the criteria for using webhooks? So one criteria that we look at is, if the real time information is really important for the other system. So for example, you're creating a product and you're creating an invoice at the same time. So it is important that before you created the invoice, the product makes it. So in this situation, there are two options. You can either have both these recipes running, and the moment a new product shows up, it makes it to the other system. So when the invoice hits the other system, the product is already there. So for timing reasons, you want to make sure that they are real time. Another approach to handling the same case is, inside the recipe itself, you check to see if the product is there, and if it's not there, you just create the product on the fly. Another reason why you may use webhooks instead of polled is, let's say that there are events that are happening in a very sparse manner. So maybe there are 5 opportunities that are created during the day. So if there are only 5 opportunities created during the day, do you want to check every 5 minutes? Because it's kind of wasteful to check it every 5 minutes. So if you want to avoid the checking every 5 minutes, that's another reason why you can use a real-time trigger. Then another one is where you would use poll is, the time criticality is not that important, right? And the changes that you're making, all you need to make sure is that it moves over to the other side. So in those cases where you don't have to do everything in, at the right at that point in time, what you can do is, for example, you can say, I will run this every 5 minutes, or you can do a scheduled job and say, I'll run this once an hour or once a day and pull information in on a longer schedule, so that's more efficient. Then, good.
There's some more questions around batch. So the first question around batch was, is there a better way?
Without using batch?
Yeah, without using batch request, send data from one app to another without using the batch API.
Well, the first thing that you need for the batch API to be useful to you is if the application itself supports batching. So, for example, Salesforce supports batching, databases support batching, but if the other application doesn't support batching, you cannot use it. Now, if it doesn't support batching, there's nothing you can do. You have to do it one by one. Right.
But if it supports batching, is there an advantage by using? What would be the scenario where somebody would use a?
So if you're moving, let's say that you're doing, batching is especially important if you're doing a lot of processing on your system. So, for example, during the initial load, let's say you fetched a whole bunch of records from a database or a CSV, and you're moving it into Salesforce or in the reverse direction. So it is much more efficient to get the whole batch out from the database, and then process in batches of 1,000 or 100, whatever, and it'll go in as one record and into Workato, and then it gets saved into Salesforce as one record. So in terms of APIs, API calls, transaction volumes, it'll be much less.
Okay, and I think you had shared this, like the example where we had 843 records in the batch. So the question has come up is it like it's considered one job, or like one job?
It's 8 jobs, and in that scenario, it'll be 9 jobs.
9 jobs.
Nine transactions.
9 transactions. Okay, so that's the other advantage of using batching. Otherwise, you'll have
843
transactions.
Right.
And Ryan has a question. Can you set up an HTTP endpoint to handle batch requests?
HTTP endpoint to set up HTTP to set up, meaning what? Just to send. So what, you could send a whole list using HTTP.
Right.
And the HTTP payload comes in. It inherently comes in with all the the list inside it.
Right.
So that whole list can be treated as one batch, and then if the receiving system has batch capability like Salesforce or database, then from that list you can put it. Now, one problem, one potential problem there is that when it comes in, can you chunk it on the trigger level if it's HTTP? Probably not. I don't think it can be chunked at the HTTP level. Let's see. So if it is HTTP, so you can do event one or the other, but I don't see a batching parameter here. So the whole thing will come in as one. It will come in as a batch of, like whatever it is. There's no chunking you can do. The whole thing will come in.
Okay.
But if you're doing an HTTP, later on in the process, in the action, even there, it'll come in as the whole thing, and you'll have to control it inside by some other mechanism, either through using lists or something like that.
Okay, so there is, this is an interesting question, old versus real time, and I'll just read it, how it's, not to be selfish, but does it matter to our users how often we run a recipe? Because Workato hosts the software and is connecting to a cloud app, right? Does it slow anything down?
It's, if you look at, in a holistic way, it is making a call every 5 minutes. So it is a more load on any of the systems that you're calling. So whether it's Salesforce or Jira or whatever, if you're polling it every 5 minutes, that 3,600, no, not 3,600, 24 times. So every hour you're making 12, and 12 times 24. So that many calls you're making to the system every day.
288 calls, close
Right.
to 300 calls. Okay.
So if it is important to you, most people, most of the systems are actually pretty easy with API limits, but some of them worry about that, and the API number of API calls will get counted. So if you have like 10 recipes and all of them are making 300 calls,
right,
that's 3,000 calls. Okay, so any other questions?
No, I think the only question from Ryan, he has that question, but I've requested him for some more details, so we can come back to that.
Okay, so another question that people ask is, what should I use? So let's say if I go back to the Salesforce example, do I use new object or do I use new or an updated object, right? And what's the difference? So most of the times, people use new updated object, but the advantage of one versus the other, if you're just pulling out new thing, if you're just pulling, if the data that you're pulling in doesn't change that much and it doesn't change after the point you pulled it, then it is easy to use new. But if you're pulling, say, opportunity and you're saying the opportunity stage has to be something and it changes after the creation, then the only option you have is to use the new updated object. One of the things that you have to watch out when you're doing the new updated object is that it is going to be triggered every time there's a change, right? So can you filter out things when something like that happens? So there are ways of doing that. One way of doing that is to, let's say that you're interested in the state change only, right? And if the state has not changed, you don't really care about it. So you can actually just look for the state change by creating another custom field, inside of Salesforce. And maybe you can, what we can do is you keep the hash of that field or a combination of fields in Salesforce, and you see if that value has changed over time, right? If the value has not changed compared to what value you are storing, then you will not process the record. So that's one way of kind of, not letting it come into your system at all. So it's actually, if it's a pretty long, it's a longer topic. I think we'll cover it when we talk about bidirectional sync. But that's one way of kind of pruning out information that is coming from updates and only processing things that are important. Another question that comes up is, should I use a scheduled query or should I use a scheduler as a trigger? And again, if it is not important for you to sync in real time, scheduler also gives you the same thing as batching, because you're making a query and you're getting a bunch of records in one shot. So it's much more efficient to process it like that. And especially for applications which don't have that support in the trigger itself, you can use the scheduler to do that. And then inside the recipe itself, you do a search to get all the records that qualify and then process it as a list. That's also more efficient. And again, in terms of the number of, if you're worried about transactions, you'll be dealing with a fewer number of transactions because you're getting only one transaction every hour or so, right? Now, one word of caution here is, many times people are doing the wrong thing because they want to reduce the number of transactions. My, advice is that first you figure out what is the right thing for you to do, and then let's talk about the transactions. Because, just because you're trying to reduce the number of transactions, you may be processing things the wrong way. So anytime you have a question about that, or, reach out to us and we can help you decide, because it's easier to do it the right way and then work out how, in a proper manner how to do that, instead of trying to batch it up and process it, and you lose visibility and you lose, timeliness and so on.
So this is a very fundamental question, like just from understanding how triggers work. So take the example like of a real-time event, right?
Mm-hmm.
And as it happened, like let's say there was the actions didn't complete successfully, there were some issues, right? But the trigger, the application, like a Salesforce new opportunity was created, and like it's a real-time event. Now, how do I access that event and reprocess? Like if I have to fix some actions in the recipe down below, once I've fixed that, how do I retrieve that event? Because that happened in real time.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a way for me to?
Okay, so I think let me talk about it in let me talk about how the trigger works, right? So the moment a trigger is, so whenever I ask the system for information, whether if I did a poll or whether it's a scheduled query, or if the system told me that something was of importance to me, I get that information in Workato. And at that point, I am storing all the information that is necessary for me. All the information that came in, I'm storing it in my own area, in my own queue. So that is not getting lost, and also it's not going to get changed. Even if there have been changes in this application itself, since that point, I will not get that new information anymore.
Right.
So that information is with me. Now, if I want to retry that record, let's say that it was because of a change in the data that was there, or because something else failed down the path, down the stream, I can. So if it was a processing logic, or if it was an intermittent error somewhere, timeout or something, I can just retry that job. Right? If I retry that job, I'm using the same trigger information that came into me the first time, right? If it was because of the sending system having problems with the data, then what I should do is, the update one will pick it up anyway, so you don't have to worry about it.
Right.
But if you don't want to do it that way, if it's a new one, if it's a new trigger, then what you can do is, as the first step in your recipe, you can do a fetch again. Okay. So you can get the latest data. Now, I want to mention two other things here. One is that when you're getting a trigger, let's say that the recipe is running, and after that point, let's say the system A went down, the sending system went down, or the receiving system went down, or the recipe went down. None of that data is actually lost. Right? So all of this data is stored in our system, or even if it is not stored, we know where was the last point I pulled data from the receiving system, and so so you don't have to be worried about data loss. Right. So it's always preserved, right? The second thing is that all the information that is coming to the system is coming into Workato is coming in the right order.
Right.
So it's all in the chronological order that the application system that was sending to me, created it in.
Yeah.
Right.
I think I didn't realize, because these are the topics we will cover in the runtime operations in the webinar that's on 16th of June. So, but probably we can go into a little more detail, because it is important. Like, there are issues that happen, there are exceptions and errors that happen when you run a recipe. Mm-hmm. So the ability to retrieve the events that have already been published by the app.
So I think so that was the so it's guaranteed delivery,
right.
And it says it's once only delivery, nothing is lost, And one other thing in that same vein is the fact that we automatically do some deduplication in the system, behind the scenes we do some deduplication. So if there's an error, and in the sending system, and it sends us information again, we know that they have seen this information once, right? Now it doesn't. Now suppose I have 3 recipes running, which are looking. All of them are looking at accounts. I will not be able to prevent, deduplication across the 3 without doing some processing in the recipe where I can search for it, and if it is already present, I don't do anything. But if it's the same recipe, if I see the same information again, I'm going to run my deduplication logic and throw away things that I've seen before.
So the recipe automatically.
Automatically will take care of it.
Okay. Amlan, we're
Any other
out of time.
questions?
No, I think there was one question, but we'll follow up with Ryan separately.
Okay.
Yeah.
So thank you, everyone. I think that like Tree was saying, in the next session we'll cover more of this troubleshooting issues and how to do runtime management and administration.
Right.
Okay. All right.
And we'll publish the videos in a day or two.
Okay.
Yeah.
And the documents and the recipes,
yes.
example recipes.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Have a great weekend, everyone.